It's a pleasure to be here with you and to attempt to fill in a few salient details to your accounting that you so dramatically call the curious case of the drunken teetotaler. Now, as we know, the fact of the drunken teetotaler is a very small part of the story, but it is rather fascinating title. So let's begin. It was a very blustery, dark, wet November afternoon when I first saw our new patient, who we will call Dave, because as you know, what's incredibly critical, given the nature of the people that we see as our patients, have seen princes and princesses and world-class athletes and the very famous, we must keep their identity well hidden. So we will call this person Dave. Dave presented to my office, anxious, nervous, wild eye patterns, and clearly in a state of some discomfort. I, as is my wont, went to shake hands and was immediately made aware of the primary issue that our new patient was attending, and that was his hands were like wet fish. Severe, what's called hyperhidrosis or severe sweating. And that was the reason that he was coming in. Although not a major affliction or anything that's life-threatening, in his job as a musician and as a recording studio operator for some very famous bands and players, he had the opportunity to shake hands with them. And on every occasion, they were completely horrified and then stayed well away from him as though he were a leper in a leper colony. Therefore, I did agree, although this was not the type of case I usually take on, agreed to work with this brilliant, kind young man. He was a well-muscled, slender, superficially very, very healthy young man. So the first thing we looked at is why was he having these sweating disorders? And as you know, good doctor, there are many conditions that can lead one to that condition. And in our work that we do, the symptom is important, but always, always, always we seek to find the root cause, because if there's one symptom, there are invariably many symptoms. So in this case, we did a typical diagnostic procedure, looked at his tongue, which amongst 100 other features, had a very red tip. I questioned him about insomnia, and he said, yes, I do, and I'm constantly anxious, primarily about my sweating, but at other times too. I took his pulse, which is standard procedure. Two factors out of the thousands of things that we would notice in a pulse stood out to me. One was the rapidity of his pulse. It was extremely rapid for a man his age and in someone that seemed to be in a healthy condition. The second thing was that his left guan pulse, which many associate with the liver, was almost non-existent. This is an unusual finding, once again, in someone his age. So I immediately started to look at what the problems could be. Now, with the aid of our modern testing that we can do, I quickly ordered a blood panel, $69, and it came back with a wealth of information. Now, what's important, always, is that we must not rush to judgment, that we must find every salient detail, every fact, so that the puzzle begins to make itself. We don't try to force pieces of the puzzle into place. We let the puzzle show itself. So in this case, we started with some very inexpensive testing, which number one indicated something that I was suspicious of, is that he had a severely overactive thyroid gland. His thyroid stimulating hormone was basically off the charts low, which is an indication that the thyroid is overactive. This can, of course, cause the sweating, the rapid heartbeat, the anxiety, and the insomnia. I recommended that he see his medical doctor. His medical doctor recommended a course of pharmaceuticals. My patient did some research, decided he didn't want to expose himself, his body, his mind to those particular pharmaceuticals, came and requested my aid for his condition. I used a Chinese herbal formula that we made from scratch. I won't bore you with all the details of the herbs that we used, but suffice to say that within 2 months, his pulses were more normal, back in a range that would be acceptable for a young man his age. And he was sweating much less. There was still some when he was very anxious, but it was much less. He was extremely excited. Other things, though, that I noticed on his blood test is that his hemoglobin A1C, which is a measure of about 3 months blood sugar levels in the body. So as the red cells, as you know, good doctor, rush through the channels in the body, through the vessels, the arteries, and the veins, they bump into sugar molecules. And the more they bump into, the more sugary coating, which is called glycosylated hemoglobin. You, I'm sure, read my monograph on glycosylated hemoglobin. It binds to the cell. So over 3 months, as the red cells age and then eventually die, we can see to the extent that exposure to the glucose or blood sugar has occurred. So that was an interesting notice. Also, his liver enzymes were very low. Now, unfortunately, many standard ranges, which by the way are never standard, they're made up by different labs, but the standard ranges for many healthcare organizations will say something like 0 to 40. That cannot be more absurd. There is nothing in medicine that is more absurd than that. The only way someone can have 0 enzyme activity in the liver is if they're a corpse, and then they're not my patient anymore. So I will never have a patient with 0 enzyme activity in the liver. Because his liver enzymes were so low, I was suspecting some issues with the liver, and on further questioning, the young man had volunteered that he had been an alcoholic for many years, a very, very heavy drinker, and had used some other substances also, but that he'd been clean and sober for many years now. Occasionally, maybe once a month, he had a beer. So we start to put the puzzle together. The pieces are all laid out. Hemoglobin A1C is too low. Liver enzymes are too low. Guan pulse is too low. Hyperthyroid. So now we can see that this is a deeper problem. On questioning, he admitted having significant gas and bloating, so we're now looking at some intestinal imbalance, which could contribute to the thyroid condition. And so we started to work with his digestive system, working on yeast infestation, or, dare say it, SIBO, a incredibly inappropriate term, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. How can you determine bacterial overgrowth when a normal, healthy human being has 100 trillion bacteria in their healthy gut? The correct term is intestinal dysbiosis, which is the term that I've used for over 20 years, which is when the ratio of bacteria gets out of balance, so that you have more of the bacteria that we would call negative in relationship to the bacteria we call positive. So it's truly an imbalance and not an overgrowth. However, I digress. So, in working with this young man, one salient feature that I had forgotten to mention is he had fairly regular migraine headaches, and they would often happen in midday. So we treated the migraines, they got slightly better, and then one day, as I had the opportunity to visit with his wife, who became a fertility patient, which is a fascinating case that we'll review in the future, she mentioned that before he got the migraines, she would detect a strange odor. On questioning, I asked her more about the odor. She said it was kind of sweet. So immediately, I began to suspect hypoglycemia. That, coupled with the pulses that I felt, with the low hemoglobin A1C, really pointed to some problems with sugar metabolism. I sent the gentleman out for an oral glucose tolerance test, which is a hideous test. You drink a glass of sugar water, and then they check your blood at regular intervals. And indeed, he had severe reactive hypoglycemia, which was triggering his migraines. So, excellent. We now had those pieces handled. So I didn't see the young man for a while, but I continued to see his wife for fertility. And she reported that, when I would ask how the young man was doing, she would report that 99% of the time he was an angel, but 1% of the time he would go into mad fits of rage and anger and just uncontrollable behaviors. So I began to consider that, but before I got very deeply into consideration, I got a call late on a Friday night from eye patient. She said her husband had been driving in their conveyance, their child in the rear seat, when he suddenly started driving erratically, driving 80, 90 miles an hour, veering between other vehicles until she finally screamed and started crying, at which time he pulled off the road, parked next to a field, got out, and ran away. She, knowing not what to do, waited. He eventually returned with blood all over his face, all over his chin and down his neck. She regained her sense and rose to the occasion, drove him to the hospital where he was admitted, had his face sutured. At that time, however, of course, they did a blood test and found out that he was almost 4 times legally inebriated. 4 times. It's a wonder he didn't crash the vehicle. So I immediately sprang to life that evening, and remembering an article that I'd read by a prominent English surgeon and doctor from London, immediately thought of Auto-Brewer Syndrome. Now, this is a topic that some people think is valid, other people think not. I am certain at this point that this is valid and has actually changed my thinking about a great many cases. There are many anecdotal episodes that people have reported where they were with their significant other all day long. They were perfectly fine. They did not have anything to drink. Suddenly would pass out in the bathtub or on the floor. When they had their blood alcohol checked, they were inebriated. So I immediately asked the couple to get a breathalyzer, a blood alcohol breathing apparatus, and to test him several times a day and to monitor everything that he ate or drank. Sure enough, every day after he consumed significant amounts of carbohydrates, he would blow a blood alcohol that put him in a legally inebriated state. We started examining his diet, found that the time that he had gotten severely inebriated, he'd eaten at one of our favorite establishments locally, Zachary's Pizza. And the thing with Zachary's that's important is it's impossible to stop eating when one is satiated. You must always have that extra piece of delicious Zachary's Pizza. Well, he did. He also had a beer. The next day, he was 4 times legally drunk. So we then went vigorously after the so-called SIBO and the leaky gut issues, resolved those. He has no hangovers anymore, and he no longer gets drunk from eating carbohydrates. The key feature of this case, though, is an important one that I spoke of earlier: the prior alcoholism and the low liver enzymes. So what I surmise in this case is that he was unable to clear alcohol from his system. Now, when yeast dies, it gives off, at last count, 187 different chemicals, one of which is acetaldehyde, which gives people the flu-like feeling when they're trying to do a cleanse or if they eat too many carbohydrates. Well, in most people with a healthy liver, they can clear those alcohols from their system. In the case of Dave, he had a very poor functioning liver, so those alcohols would build up in his system until he became legally inebriated. So that, my friends, is the case of the drunken teetotaler. Thank you. Hi, y'all. I would really appreciate it if you would like this video and leave us a comment.